to Constangy TV's Close-Up on Workplace Law, where we zoom in on recent developments of interest to employers, to their attorneys, and to their human resources professionals. I'm your host, Leigh Tyson, and I'm a partner in Constangy's Atlanta office. But I am also the co-chair of Constangy's Traditional Labor Practice Group. So here today to join us is my other co-chair, Jonathan Martin. And Jonathan is a partner in our Macon, Georgia office. And he practices in pretty much all areas of employment law, but in particular, he shines in the area of traditional labor. And so that means all issues relating to the National Labor Relations Act, where he represents employers in front of the NLRB and in federal courts. He also gives a lot of training and he helps navigate union campaigns and pretty much all of that good stuff, right?
That's right. Well, good afternoon, work life.
It's nice to see you, work husband. So we do a lot together, given the fact that we are both the co-chairs of this practice group, and labor law tends to be pretty all-consuming when cases really get started and going. But it's a good thing that, since we do spend so much time together, it's good that we actually like each other. My thing about the NLRA, and something that I've noticed as a traditional labor attorney, and you probably have too, is the fact that when we go in and give speeches and we talk about Title VII, everybody knows what we're talking about. You talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, they know what we're talking about. But when you say NLRA, you get a lot of blank faces, and you also get a lot of people who just say, well, I don't have a union, so that doesn't really apply to me. Those people are not correct, are they?
Yeah, the National Labor Relations Act is the law that gives employees the right to join a labor organization. But it's actually much broader than that. It applies to all private employers in the United States of America. Generally, there are a few whose dollar revenues are too small to be covered, but for the most part, it applies to everybody. And so you've got a group called the National Labor Relations Board that enforces it. And so frequently I have employers say, well, I don't worry about that because I'm non-union. Well, if you think you're non-union, think again, because the National Labor Relations Act probably applies to your organization. And if you ever have a problem, if you use common sense and good judgment, you are probably going to come up with the wrong answer rather than the right answer.
Correct. Yeah, I think probably the most common scenario we hear of is you have a small employer who doesn't really have much familiarity with the NLRA or the rules, and an employee goes in and says, "Hey, boss, we got a couple of guys out there talking about joining a union, and they're handing around cards, and they say there's going to be a meeting. I mean, just wanted to let you know." And the boss very reasonably would respond by saying, "What guys? What's their problem? What's this meeting? I should go to this meeting too and talk to these guys. What do they want? How can I fix it? If I fix it, will it go away?" These are things that are not unnatural responses. And
they're perfectly natural responses.
Yeah, but how many times did you violate the law?
A lot. Just because they're natural doesn't mean they're lawful. And there's the problem. We use an acronym when we do management training. Some people call it the PITS rule. Some people call it the TIPS rule. I'm not that sophisticated. Plus, I like juvenile humor. So I call it the SPIT rule. You can't spit on your employees. It means you can't spy, you can't promise, you can't interrogate, and you can't threaten. And so to use your scenario, well, we did a lot of that. I mean, number one, we interrogated right off the bat. Who's behind this? Who's involved? What's going on? What are your problems? Those are all natural things to say, and those are all unlawful interrogations. Of course, the tendency is when you hear there's a meeting, right? Hey, there's a meeting at the Holiday Inn. Well, most people are curious, and they'll ride through the parking lot to see whose car's there. Here's the problem. If you know what their car looks like, they know what your car looks like, and they will immediately go out and take a picture of you riding through the parking lot. And of course, now with smartphones, they will be able to geo-stamp it, time stamp it, the whole shebang. Wonderful evidence for the National Labor Relations Board. Of course, when it comes to promises, so a lot of times managers tend to what we call solicit grievances. Basically, what's your problem? Why is everybody unhappy? Well, the board has taken the position that that really is a form of an unlawful promise. I mean, think about it from this perspective. For those of you who are married, right, if you notice that your spouse is unhappy and you say something like, what are you mad about? Well, they are expecting you to immediately fix what the problem is when they tell you what they're mad about. The same principle applies to employees. If they tell you what they're mad about, well, they're expecting you to fix it. So it's an unlawful promise. So the unlawful solicitation of grievances. And of course, the grandmother of all labor violations, the threat. If you unionize, we'll just move all of our production to China. That'll get you in big trouble all the time. But so much of the natural response is unfortunately an unlawful response, which again is why management training is so incredibly important.
Right, it totally is, because like you said, it's just so counterintuitive. You think you're doing the right thing, and under many statutes, it makes sense for you to talk things out with your employees, but this is not one of them.
It is not one of them. What the Act also says is employees have the right to engage in protected, concerted activity for their mutual aid and protection, which means in the non-union context or even in the non-organizing context, employees still have the right to come together and basically rely on each other, which means they can gripe, they can share information, concerted, more than one, protected. There's certain subjects that are protected: wages, benefits, working conditions, treatment, and the like. And so in the context of handbooks, we frequently see violations. A common one that I see just in almost every handbook: employees are prohibited from discussing their wages. Well, listeners or viewers, I should say, they have every right to discuss their wages and speculate about yours. The only difference is if they happen to have a confidential position, like say, for example, they're a payroll clerk, and by virtue of their position, they have access to confidential information, then you can prohibit confidential employees from sharing confidential information. But when it comes to, I'm making $11 an hour, how much are you making? How much you think the boss is making? Isn't he overpaid? That's perfectly lawful, even though it torques off most people in corporations.
Yeah, so another thing that's kind of unique about the NLRA that you don't see with other statutes is the fact that it tends to change. Like the law stays the same, but the interpretation of the law, we were just talking about handbooks, that tends to change a lot over time. There's always a shift. It's a moving target. So talk about that a little bit.
That's right. Well, all right, so that's one of the things that makes the National Labor Relations Act unique. Yes, our federal courts at some point in time get involved, but for the most part, what a lot of people don't appreciate is there's an organization known as the National Labor Relations Board. It is probably the most powerful, least understood of all of the judicial systems in the United States of America. And it is a very openly political body. So during a president's administration, for the most part, the president will completely repopulate the board. They have staggered terms. And the way that it typically works is that a president will appoint 3 people from his or one day her party and 2 people from the opposition party. Well, organized labor tends to be a much larger contributor to Democratic candidates than Republican candidates. Big business tends to be a larger contributor to Republicans than Democrats. So typically the Democratic boards, and we refer to them by the sitting president, the Obama board, the Bush board, the Trump board, the Clinton board, they tend to be, for example, under a Democratic president, they tend to be a little bit more pro-union in their interpretations of the law. Under a Republican administration, they tend to be a little bit more pro-employer. Under the last administration, they seem to be much more radically pro-labor than under the current administration, which is trying to rein in some of the policy positions that they took under the last president.
So now that we've sort of got like labor law 101 out of the way, let's turn to some of the new things that are happening. You just mentioned the shift that happens in between presidents. Now that we have the Trump board, what do you think is the biggest benefit so far to employers that we've seen?
All right, well, what I would say is probably the appointment of the new general counsel.
Yeah.
So the general counsel is basically the prosecutor of the National Labor Relations Act, and they really set policy.